3. All right. And we are live.
Amazing.
Anjay, I am so excited for today's topic. The fact that you want to talk about this, it was actually your idea. And I'm like, I love this. This is some of my favorite stuff. And I don't even think I've scratched the surface on how much of an expert you are on all things go to market and sales excellence. And really, you're the perfect hybrid of like sales meets execution meets really deep technical chops. So before we get into it, I want to talk a little bit about you. Yale graduate, you have an extensive engineering background. You are a go-to-market leader at Google Cloud. And also, interestingly, have like a management consulting background. So I guess let's start there. For those who don't know you, tell us about yourself.
Yeah, thank you so much, Sabrina. Super excited to be a part of this discussion. As you touched on this, I think if there's one thing, I want everybody to know is, I love solving problems. I love being a part of new things and scaling them out. And you can see that as a part of my background. So, obviously it comes from my engineering background, my MBA degree at Yale. And then, a lot of it comes from the management consulting background at IBM. And over the last 15 years, I've just honed in on the go-to-market side of the house, and have different perspectives on go-to-market. From a bigger company like IBM to a smaller company like VMware to a hyper-growth company like Google Cloud. So cannot be more excited to be here.
Yeah, it's good stuff. And I found that when we talk, we could go like into a rabbit hole about any one of these topics. So we'll have to do a part 2. Literally, just yesterday or 2 days ago, you were asking about adult learning and retention rates and what influences retention rate in adults. And so this is stuff that I live for. I'm excited for this. So
Absolutely.
I think maybe, so you talked a little bit about your experience and your background. So maybe let's start there. What is some of maybe the biggest lesson that you've learned when it comes to go-to-market strategy? And is that evolving now? I know everyone's shifting and everyone wants to talk about either AI or security. Everything has that sticker on it right now. And in some cases, rightfully so, not always. But is that sort of those biggest lessons learned, is that translating into today's market, or does that look different?
Yeah, I think it's a very important topic that you raised, Sabrina. I mean, over the years, obviously the focus has kind of changed. Let me touch on what we have seen, or what I have observed in the last 2-3 years. As the macro environment also has shifted drastically. So it used to be the time, like if you go back in 2010, there were a few select companies who were on this hyper growth curve, and then other bigger companies like IBM, HPs of the world were all focused on optimizing their go to market engine and so on. And that kind of shifted in the last 5-10 years, where you had like this explosion in SaaS software and other things, where companies were a lot of companies were actually growing super explosively. And so it was all about scaling and scaling, and it kind of accelerated as we went into the COVID wave. You had like this massive explosion in software revenues and things like that. And so a lot of companies grew at tremendous rates during the COVID time. And then we came back as the interest rates rose. Obviously there was a lot of sensitivity to now the bottom line. And so now the biggest question was, how do we do more with less? And so you have companies across the board. It started with Meta, with the year of efficiency, and all other companies kind of thinking about new ways to do more with less. And now with generative AI in action, of course that has taken a lot of momentum. around how we can automate a lot of different things, including go to market workflows and everything else within an organization's umbrella.
Oh, I could talk about the data that's tied into go to market and the possibilities, not just around automation, but utilizing data effectively. And that's a whole nother topic in and of itself, but a very, very fun one. But you said a couple of things there that I couldn't agree more with, which is, I think you're right. There's a lot of similarities. There's some overlap between what's kind of always been the norm and what we're seeing now. And I'm glad you brought up sort of the impact around COVID. But interestingly, you're right. People are having to deal with different buckets of money, where that money is coming, how they're able to use it, different levels of resources, outsourcing in different ways, to your point, trying to leverage tools to be more efficient, to do more with less. But, I think part of where I see at least the biggest change is how we're going to market and the kinds of assets, the kinds of messaging that it's taking to go to market now. It's just a whole level. It's a different skill set. I think it's a different persona. It's more now. It's more focused on a solution. It's more focused on an outcome, really. Like, what are we doing with my business? So that means you're selling to different people. So not only are you doing more with less, but you're really taking on whole new skill sets and markets.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think as if you take a step back and look at overall go to market, right, rough framework of like what we sell, who we sell to, and how we sell, right? I think this kind of like a Venn diagram, if you want to visualize a little bit, and I think underlying that is like this foundational go to market strategy, and then you have like the people and culture component of it, which are extremely important to have like that high performance go to market organization. So you touched on like how we sell, but I think all those three buckets have to work perfectly in cohesion in order to build that notion of sustainable growth, right? Which is, I'm focused on driving top line growth, but also controlling my costs. And so as you rightly said, across those three buckets, who we sell to, the customer, the personas, right now it's all about driving customer adoption, consumption and things like that. Being outcome driven, mission driven, I think are like extremely important in that who we sell to bucket. I think how we sell, it's all about like empowering the sales force. Enablement, I think, takes a very, very center stage, and all other extensions of how we sell to, including partners, and other things, I think become really, really important. And then you touched on the solutions, right? Like I would say, that comes under like what we sell bucket. Especially as companies are scaling, they're becoming multi-portfolio, right? Like multi-product. So they have a wider portfolio. And so it has evolved from like this transactional selling of products and features to, solutions that are more outcome driven and more, can increasingly demonstrate what is the business outcome, right? So I think those are the three big ones. And then underlying that, I think it's cannot underscore enough to have that very clear and articulate go-to-market strategy, because that, if you do not have that, there like their go-to-market organization today is getting complex and complex, right? Like you have multiple teams, multiple specialist teams, multiple customer engineering teams, customer success and whatnot. And so having that North Star around the go-to-market strategy, I think is extremely important. And then, the other thing is, the people and culture part. Like, obviously we want to have a high performance go-to-market organization. And so, culture and people, I think, become really, really important as well.
Oh, and I think one of the advantages, and I still sometimes can't believe I get paid to do this, but this is, like this is my dream job. I cannot believe that I get paid for this. But I get a chance to see so many organizations firsthand and how they deal with this. And a very good friend of mine at a, one of the larger hyperscalers, not Google, said, Sabrina, how much do you think this culture stuff is really? And I'm like, oh man, did you come to me with the right question? I love this stuff because I do think sometimes we can over rotate and sometimes that's necessary. And we won't get into all of that, sort of the evolutionary psychology behind that. But, to your point, I think there is a lot to be said, even just from a neurological standpoint, about the environment that you create and someone's ability to learn, retain, and then really like master and generalize sort of that next level of learning information. And then if you can take that and innovate, that's how you get like those late night, crazy excited teams working together, just having a great time. And that still happens even in today's environment. And then I get to see other organizations where it's nasty, it's cutthroat, it's political. And guess who's not having a great time taking, solutions to market or innovating or saying, or feeling safe enough to say, you know what, Sabrina, I kind of like Anjai's idea better. I think we should go with it. And then me having, sort of the humility or whatever to say, yeah, actually, you know what, you're right. And kind of moving on. So I think that is such an understated point. And there's a lot of ways that you can do that also for cheap or, very inexpensively. So that shouldn't be a cost or travel, component. But you also said everything, you outlined those 3 buckets and I can already see like the Yale, the education coming out. You make things seem so simple. And that's, I think, the key. Those 3 buckets are all changing that you outlined. And the way you are successful with those is you keep it simple and you execute. I think way too much you can see proverbial can see people get so stuck in the strategy or the talking and the meetings to meet, to talk, that it's in some cases you got to get to market, make a decision and move. You've got to execute. And I get it. Right now it is hard to execute, but there are other levers that you can pull there. But it's not just execute, it's keep it simple. And that just every time you were talking about those 3 buckets, I'm like, yep, got to keep it simple. Yep, got to keep it simple. And I can't underscore enablement enough because when you have less people to do more, you have to have empowered people. It's the only way that equation can be successful. It's the only way. And so you don't have enablement that meets the learner where they're at, you're going to fail. It doesn't matter how pretty your slick is. It doesn't matter how great your marketing is. It's going to fail because there's so many pieces to a go-to-market that if your core is not enabled, if your foundation is not established, it's going to crumble.
No, absolutely. I think you make an excellent point, which is, like from a go-to-market perspective, getting those 3 buckets and operating, ultimately, I think it boils down to execution, right? And I think, I've been a part of companies who, over rotate on strategy, have multiple weeks/months of like planning cycles and things like that, right? But ultimately, it boils down to how well you're able to execute against that strategy. And so that linkage and accountability has to be very, very clear. And some companies that do a really, really good job are the ones who are able to define a strategy, execute, and then again pivot if it's not working well, and you pivot and you pivot, right? I think that's how you scale, especially for a company which has a very established addressable market. Like if there's a very, very big TAM there to capture, execution, I think, becomes really, really key. And how do you execute? It's basically making sure those 3 buckets are working together, and you empower the sales team through the culture element that you said, which is, a culture that is focused on transparency, innovation, and is like extremely data driven, right? Like to the extent possible. Now, everything cannot be data driven, but to the extent possible, like, because I've seen companies, there's a lot of opinions and things like that, but you want to have a culture that is extremely data driven and is focusing on like the big key metrics that we need to move.
Right. And I have literally seen you do this in practice. So if I can what's the opposite of throwing under the bus? But I guess brag about you for a second. So I'm like, what's the opposite of that? Literally have seen you do this in real time. We met because you were building an entire onboarding enablement kickoff for a very senior group and fairly diverse in experience and ownership and region, and a big group, an important group to the business, and people flying in from all over, including a lot of leadership, lots of eyeballs on you. And remind me, how much time did you have?
I think this was, I think, a 2-day event,
Yeah,
right?
right.
It was
Full
a
2 days. Yeah. Oh yeah.
full 2 days, and again, I think it was all about, it started with how do we scale the business, right?
Right.
Like, how do we scale the business? We see a tremendous opportunity out there for from a TAM perspective. The question is, how are we able to empower our teams and execute it in a fast manner? And so, the event that you're recollecting, we got it, folks, for 2 days. What I was focused on was, we are doing a lot of, like, crystallization of strategy. It has to be easy for folks to absorb. It's not, we shouldn't be throwing a lot of them, especially if there are new people. And then, ultimately, how do we measure the outcome, right? Generally, for a go to market organization, the outcome is very, very simple. It has to result in pipeline generation. It has to result in, key new customer that you acquire. And more importantly, especially for a SaaS company, or anybody operating in cloud, you want to make sure your customers are increasing their consumption. And so, in some ways, you are advancing the customer journeys and making sure they are leveraging all this great product portfolio that you have. And so
Right.
that becomes basically, it's like the entire thing can be boiled down into 3 to 5 KPIs, which are the North Star of how you will measure the outcome of this. Now, I think it might take 3 months, it might take 6 months, it might take 9 months. But I think what you want to do is, have the strategy in place and then execute maniacally,
Right.
through data driven, and then you pivot where things are not working, right? So that's what we're on the journey together for.
And it was, I mean, it was awesome. It was incredible. The results were great, but it was also a lot of fun because it was
Yeah.
so, I mean, I think if my memory serves me right, I think we had 3 weeks to do it, maybe a little bit more. I can't remember, but
Yeah,
it was
it
about
was, I think,
that.
the shortest turnaround. I think, it was, again, I think it's going with the spirit of moving fast. We want to move
That's
fast and we
exactly what
want
I
to
said.
pivot, right? So it was, I think we had like 2 3 weeks to plan this out. And especially, as we're hitting like the second half, we saw an opportunity that if you do this right, you can actually increase the momentum, and especially so as you hit the next year. And so, we put this together. But I think the most important thing, Sabrina, as a part of that journey, was we were asking the questions and forcing the leadership, to crystallize the strategy, right? Like,
Mhm.
many times, there are initiatives in place, etc., which are not necessarily cleanly tied to the overall strategy. And so that's where you have that break. Because then there's a strategy and execution break, and then many of the things actually you cannot measure or figure out whether this is successful or not. And so, if you remember, like, for the 3 weeks, we were trying to bring together, ask these questions: what is the strategy? Once we have alignment, then, like, figure out the execution plan and how we measure.
Right. And I will tell you, so a little like pro tip, or how do you make this actionable? One of the best things that I've found works when you've noticed that misalignment is write it down.
Yeah.
Put it on a piece of paper and say, I think this is our mission statement and this is what we're doing. What am I missing? Because sometimes when we say something out loud, it sounds better, or we can talk ourselves into something, than when you really look at it and go, oh, I do see the disconnect. Okay, we got to add in maybe this benchmark, or we've got to add in this layer, or whatever it might be. So yeah, you're completely right.
And that's where I think OKRs are a great tool, not to
Yeah,
over rotate on them, but I
right.
think they provide a lot of value to drive that shared vision and alignment across different teams.
Yeah, yeah. And then you said, sort of the next most important thing, which is also highlighted in my, brag about you, which is I think a lot of times people think good strategy, doing it right has to take a long time. I think they misinterpret, doing strategy to your point for a year or a quarter, whatever, is necessary to execute a good go to market.
Mhm.
And you clearly proved it's not. Not that we did an entire go to market, because go to market really is a continuum, if you will. It doesn't
Yeah,
really, you don't just go to market and call it a
yeah,
day. Um, but nonetheless, I think to your point, if you can iterate throughout each step, it allows you to move the ball forward, because a lot of what sort of is different now, I think one of the changes that we're noticing in this market is you've got to get to market faster. It is a lot about speed. It almost feels like the news cycle now, you've kind of got to get ahead. And some of that is because there's a little bit of FOMO. Companies feel like they have to have a message, so then they get out too fast. It really is striking that balance. But to your point, what saves you every time is when you're willing to pivot. Look at the data, execute, look at the data, and then be willing to
yes.
pivot if you need to.
Yes, exactly. And you could see this in action last 18 months from a generative AI perspective. I mean, how has that transformed, the entire landscape has kind of moved. Google obviously is at the front and center of this. You can see so many companies who have pivoted, very aggressively,
Right.
pivoted their other things, right, to stay relevant, right? And so, like, this is not even a long time, like it's just 12, 18 months, and so you can already see how things are changing, very fast.
It's I love this kind of stuff. Like I said, I know we're already over on time, dang it. But we haven't even talked about how do you measure business impact. We haven't even
Okay.
talked about like how is content actually changing. By the way, spoiler alert, it's user generated. But yeah, I mean, there's just so much that I want to talk about in Simple. So we're gonna have you back on. Um,
Absolutely.
where can people find you? Because you are such a wealth of knowledge and you're really great at kind of simplifying this and making it actionable. So are you on LinkedIn? Do you have a
Yes,
blog?
I'm definitely on LinkedIn, very active on LinkedIn, posting my thoughts, so that is the best way to reach out to me.
Awesome. All right.
All
Well,
right.
until next time, thank you, my friend.
Awesome.
See
Thank
you
you
soon.
very much, Sabrina. Thank you.